What happens when one of Britain's most celebrated actors walks into what should have been a polite morning TV interview, only to meet a host who seems determined to tear him apart? A friendly chat was promised. But in barely half a minute, a single, innocent question would explode into one of the most jaw-dropping live confrontations daytime television has ever seen. The cameras were rolling, the lights blinding, and the audience at home had no idea they were about to witness a meltdown so tense it would send social media into overdrive. Anthony Hopkins, the legendary performer who has conquered Hollywood for decades, settled into the bright studio chair with the calm confidence of a man who has faced the world and won. He smoothed his tie, gave a courteous nod to the crew, and prepared for what he thought would be a routine chat about his latest film, a thriller poised to thrill audiences everywhere. Across from him, Lorraine Kelly wore her trademark smile, the one millions had trusted for years. But behind those cheerful eyes flickered something different, a sharp glint of challenge. "So, Anthony," she began, her lilting Scottish accent wrapping the words in sugar, while the edges cut like glass. "Tell us about this new film of yours. I have to say, watching the trailer, I couldn't help but wonder, aren't you getting a bit too old for these action roles?" The question dropped like a poisoned arrow. Viewers leaned closer to their screens. Crew members stiffened. Anthony's distinguished eyebrows lifted ever so slightly. A flicker of surprise passed across his face, swift but unmistakable. This was not his first interview. He'd weathered decades of blunt critics and invasive reporters. But there was something uniquely biting about the way Lorraine had framed that opening salvo. "Well, Lorraine," Anthony answered, his deep voice smooth but edged with quiet authority. "I believe age brings experience, and experience brings depth to any character. I don't see myself as too old. I see myself as seasoned." Lorraine's smile widened, but the warmth was gone. What remained was the cool grin of a predator who sensed blood in the water. "Seasoned, yes," she purred, "but surely you must realize that audiences today crave fresh faces, younger energy. Don't you think it's a bit desperate clinging to these roles when it might be time to step aside for the next generation?" The air thickened. A low murmur rippled through the studio as cameras caught the almost imperceptible tightening of Anthony's jaw. This was supposed to be a soft promotional spot, a chance to charm British viewers before the film's release. Instead, it was turning into a televised ambush. "I wouldn't call it clinging," Anthony replied, his voice still calm but now carrying a subtle steel that longtime fans would instantly recognize. "I'd call it passion for the craft, something I suspect you might not fully understand, given your background." The words were delivered like a velvet-covered blade, polite but unmistakably cutting. Lorraine's eyes flashed. For a split second, the polished TV persona cracked, revealing something colder and far more dangerous. "My background," she echoed with a brittle laugh. "At least I didn't have to play a cannibal to get people's attention. Some of us built our careers on talent, not shock value." Gasps whispered through the studio. The Hannibal Lecter reference was a cheap shot, everyone knew it. That iconic role had earned Anthony global acclaim, proving his unmatched range. To reduce it to mere shock value wasn't just insulting, it was pure professional disrespect. "Shock value," Anthony repeated, his voice dropping to that hypnotic whisper that once froze moviegoers in their seats. "Is that what you think acting is? Creating unforgettable characters? Exploring the human condition? All just shock to you?" Lorraine leaned forward, sensing she'd struck a nerve. "Oh, come now, Anthony. Don't be so sensitive. We all know that role was just you hamming it up, playing to the cheap seats. Real actors don't need theatrics." The accusation landed like a punch. To dismiss one of cinema's most intricate performances as mere cheap theatrics revealed either staggering ignorance or deliberate malice. Anthony's hands, which had rested calmly on his knees, began to curl slowly into fists. "Theatrics," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Now you want to talk about theatrics? What would you call this little performance of yours? This isn't journalism, this isn't even entertainment, this is cruelty dressed up in television lights." The studio fell into an eerie hush. Only the hum of cameras and the faint rustle of stage equipment filled the air. Even the usually chatty production assistants froze, eyes locked on the escalating showdown happening a few feet away. Lorraine's practiced smile faltered for a heartbeat, then snapped back into place like a rubber band stretched too far. "Cruelty?" she said, tilting her head. "I'm simply asking the questions viewers at home are already thinking. Isn't it time you admitted that your best days are behind you? That just maybe you're holding on to something that's already slipped away?" The words were sharpened to wound, each one aimed directly at the quiet fears every aging performer carries in the back of their mind. But Anthony Hopkins was no ordinary actor. He had faced down personal demons, beaten addiction, and rebuilt his career more than once. He knew how to stare darkness in the eye and come out stronger. A flicker of icy resolve settled over his face, the kind of quiet power that made audiences hold their breath in theaters around the world. He rose slowly from his chair, each movement deliberate, each second stretching like a drum roll before a final note. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter as he straightened his jacket and met Lorraine's gaze without a single blink. "My best days," Anthony said, his voice low and resonant, "are the ones I decide to create, not the ones a television host tries to bury." His words cut through the silence like a blade, each syllable echoing in the cavernous studio. A camera operator shifted nervously, his lens trembling slightly as he zoomed in on Anthony's face, capturing every ounce of the actor's controlled fury. Lorraine tried to match his stare, but for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, her confidence faltered. "That's a bold claim," she said, her smile thinning into a straight line. "But you can't deny that the industry is changing. Viewers crave novelty. Isn't it exhausting to fight a tide you can't stop?" Anthony tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smirk breaking the tension. "Exhausting?" he repeated, savoring the word. "I've spent my life chasing roles that challenge me. The tide you speak of, it's nothing compared to the storms I've already faced." The crowd behind the cameras, producers, assistants, even makeup artists stood frozen, eyes darting between the two as if watching a high-stakes chess match. Lorraine's fingers tightened around the cue cards resting in her lap. For the first time, the carefully scripted questions felt useless. "But surely," she pressed on, her voice straining to regain its usual sparkle, "there must come a point where you consider stepping aside, passing the torch, as they say." Anthony leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a near whisper that demanded attention. "Passing the torch isn't surrender," he said. "It's a choice, and I'll make that choice when I'm ready, not when someone behind a desk decides it's convenient." The studio audience, silent until now, shifted in their seats, the tension almost unbearable. Lorraine blinked, caught between pushing further and retreating. The cameras captured every flicker of uncertainty. "It sounds," she finally said, "as if you're determined to hold on no matter the cost." Anthony's eyes narrowed slightly, the faint glimmer of a challenge sparking within them. "Determined to hold on?" he echoed. "No. Determined to live. There's a difference. One is fear, the other is purpose." A heavy silence followed, stretching across the studio like a taut wire, ready to snap. Viewers at home could almost hear the collective intake of breath as the veteran actor's words sank in. Lorraine exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering a fraction as if the weight of the confrontation had finally settled on her. "Purpose," she murmured, barely audible. "That's quite a statement." Anthony gave the faintest nod. "It's the only statement that matters." Another beat passed before Lorraine found her professional smile again, but the edges were no longer sharp. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. What began as an ambush had become a masterclass in composure. Cameras kept rolling, but the interview was no longer about a film. It was about something far bigger, the resilience of a man who refused to be dismissed. Lorraine adjusted the papers in her lap, pretending to check her notes while she searched for a way back to safe territory. The playful banter she had planned was long gone, replaced by the uneasy realization that Anthony had seized control of the entire room. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "the audience will see this passion of yours in the new film. It must be demanding to bring so much energy to such a challenging role." Her voice softened, a subtle retreat hidden behind a neutral question. Anthony remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. "Demanding?" he said with a measured smile. "Only if you see work as a burden. I see it as a gift. Every character gives me another life to live, another truth to discover." The quiet power of his words filled the studio, washing over the crew like a slow, unstoppable tide. Lorraine forced a small laugh, trying to regain a touch of her usual brightness. "You certainly know how to make an interview memorable." "I don't set out to," Anthony replied, his eyes steady. "But when someone tries to define me by numbers or years, I feel compelled to remind them age is not a cage." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the crew. Even the sound technician, usually hidden behind his console, nodded slightly as if he'd just witnessed a rare piece of truth on live TV. Lorraine shifted again, her polished television instincts fighting the urge to apologize. "It seems," she said, "that you've answered every question before I've even asked it." "Then perhaps," Anthony said, his voice smooth but unyielding, "the real question isn't about my age or my career. Perhaps it's about why we're so eager to put people into boxes they never belonged in." The cameras captured every beat of silence that followed. Viewers across the country could feel the weight of his challenge, a quiet rebuke to every shallow headline and careless soundbite. Lorraine finally exhaled, the last of her defensive posture melting away. "That's quite a perspective," she admitted, her tone softer now, almost respectful. Anthony gave a slight nod and settled back into his chair, the storm in his eyes giving way to a calm, steady glow. "Perspective comes with living," he said, "and I intend to keep living, on my own terms, as long as I can draw breath." The studio lights seemed warmer now, less harsh, as if even the equipment understood that something profound had just been spoken. Lorraine glanced at the camera, her trademark smile returning, but this time it carried a trace of humility. "Well," she said, "I think audiences will be eager to see this film, and perhaps to see exactly why you continue to command the screen." Anthony inclined his head politely. "I appreciate that," he said simply. The director gave a silent signal, but no one moved to wrap the segment. It was as if the entire crew wanted to linger in the charged stillness that Anthony had created. Lorraine cleared her throat. "Anthony Hopkins, everyone," she said at last, her voice carrying a note of admiration she hadn't planned. "A man proving that true talent never ages." The audience behind the cameras erupted into applause, a wave of sound that broke the tension and filled the studio with sudden warmth. Anthony offered a gracious smile, but his eyes remained steady, calm, confident, and utterly unshaken by the ambush that had tried to rattle him. As the applause swelled, Lorraine extended her hand. He took it firmly, his polite nod, a final reminder of who had truly controlled this encounter from start to finish. The camera light blinked red, signaling the end of the live segment, but the electricity in the room lingered like a storm that refuses to leave. Even after the broadcast cut to commercial, the crew continued to stare, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would replay across social media for days to come. Anthony stepped away from the chair, his stride unhurried, his presence as commanding off camera as it had been on. One assistant whispered to another, "That was incredible." The other simply nodded, still stunned by the quiet ferocity they had just seen. Outside the studio, the buzz had already begun. Tweets, posts, and clips were flying across the internet before Anthony even reached his car. Viewers were calling it everything from the interview of the year to a live masterclass in grace under fire. And somewhere in the control room, a producer muttered the truth everyone now understood. Anthony Hopkins hadn't just survived a brutal ambush, he had turned it into a legendary triumph. The cameras may have stopped rolling, but the moment was already immortal. As Anthony disappeared into the London morning, one thing was certain: no one would ever look at a routine daytime interview the same way again.